Welcome to the MMA Lockcast. I'm your host, Manpreet, aka MMA Lock of the Night, your boy on social media at MMALOTN, and the architect behind the MMA Fight Archive, with over 3,800 fighter profiles currently live for you guys to research from. We ensure you leave no stone unturned when you're researching these upcoming MMA events. We cover over 17 different promotions from all over the world, and it's going to be very useful when the Contender Series kicks off in August. So if you guys want access to that, there is a 7-day free trial for you to check it out for free and see all of the fighters that we have on there, and ensure that you are, once again, leaving no stone unturned, as we have as many fight links on there for you to get direct access to these fights, to research these fighters that you may not know too much about, and try to analyze them, break them down, predict them, handicap them however you want. We got handicappers, analysts, commentators, coaches, fighters, all on this service, and they trust this service to ensure that they leave no stone unturned. So check it out for free. 7-day free trial, link in the description below. That is the MMA Fight Archive. All right, this week we're going to be talking about UFC Vegas 93, headlined by a flyweight matchup between Perez and Tatsuro Taira. It is a make or break spot for Perez to go out there and follow up that big win that he had over Matthias Nicolau back in April. And for Taira, he's taken this a big step up in competition after racking up a handful of wins in the UFC, and now gets the biggest opportunity and platform at a young age of, I believe, 24 years old. Let's see if he can get the job done. Now, I do apologize for the tardiness of the podcast dropping on Tuesday night, probably Wednesday morning by the time the YouTube makes it live here. Had a brutal UFC this past weekend. I did have a very solid regional run with the 5 events that we had there, profiting on all 5, but we gave about half of that profit back on a very abysmal UFC card. I think I got 3 or 4 predictions correct. I was just all over the place on that card. I'll talk about the lock of the night I had there in Eduardo Mora. Way too much overconfidence there, especially with how Denise Gomez was getting out-grappled by fighters like Loma Lukbunmi and Angela Hill, and I expected Mora to be able to implement a similar style, but unfortunately Gomez showcased solid takedown defense, good get-ups, and really just put the pressure on Mora there, and Mora obviously started to slow down in that spot. So a bit of a wayward pick for me there, a little bit careless if I got to be honest. That stopped a sweep of lock of the night plays for the weekend, as we did go 5-0 on the regional events, but we took that L on the UFC. So again, pretty much taking back half the profit there. So in terms of lock of the night plays, we do increase the percentage here in hit rate with the regional performance that we had. So now it's at 42 and 21 on the year for a 67% hit rate. And then the dog of the night, a pretty abysmal pick there as well with Thiago Moises, as he was unable to get off any big shots on Klein there. I thought the fight was kind of close up until the ending of that first round, where Klein was able to hurt him with the big shot. I don't think Moises ever recovered from that, and he was unable to get off on any of his own success. I really thought his activity level would allow him to stay ahead of Klein, but it seemed like he was a little bit too gun shy after getting cracked the way that he did, that he just went away from his entire game plan. Tried going for some takedowns in the second round, but once that didn't come to fruition, it was pretty much smooth sailing for Ludovic Klein there. On the regional scene, we had 2 dog of the night plays there, a plus 195 on KSW, and then I believe it was plus 115 on Octagon with Iwan Sordu, but 0-4 on the rest of the weekend in terms of dog of the night prediction. So that now brings our dog of the night record for 2024 to 20 and 43 with a 32% hit rate there. Again, still need to claw back into the profit in that spot, but very happy, like I said, with the lock of the night performances on the regional scene. Just had to tie it together on the UFC side of things. I was really initially leaning on the Zach Reese and Julian Marquez under 1.5 there, and I should have ended up pulling the trigger as a lock of the night play there, had it as a smaller track play, but that should have been the one. 20 seconds to get the job done there. That probably should have been the spot there as well. So after an abysmal run on the UFC this weekend, I wanted to take Sunday completely off, not really even thinking about the UFC or breaking down fights, and then slowly breaking down fights on Monday and Tuesdays as I post them on the Patreon page, and now finally getting around to doing the podcast for you guys. So Wednesday night it is now, or sorry, Wednesday early morning by the time this drops. But Wednesday we'll still have a ton of other content. I'll be dropping my top 3 lock of the night candidates and top 3 dog of the night candidates, but I will also be dropping probably by midnight Wednesday, the PFL breakdown, because we have PFL on Thursday this week. I originally thought it was Friday, but it is Thursday, so I want to be able to get that out for you guys on Wednesday evening as soon as I can. So keep your eyes peeled for that. I'll have you guys covered there. And then the rest of the content for the UFC will roll out as usual throughout fight week. So appreciate the understanding. I'm sure a lot of people are going to be coming back to rag on my picks from last week, but that's just the case. Some weeks we're on, some weeks we're off. So if you want to come in here and give me a taste of my own medicine with the shit talking, go for it. Hopefully we're able to bounce back this week, and I can come back at you just as strong next week. All right. Reminder, Locking Two-Step and Locking Trinity free parlays normally drop to the public on Fridays, but I drop it much earlier in the week for the Patreon folks so they're able to get a better number. Didn't work out for this past weekend as we pretty much got reverse swept there, but I'm feeling a lot better about it this week and feel like we can get back on the winning track there and continue adding to the profit that we already have from the free parlay this week. So if you want to check that out, check out the Lock of the Night Patreon page, link in the description below. This week, I've started dropping 3 free breakdowns so you guys can get a glimpse and a peek at what I normally do for my best predictions post that I do for the Patreon page. Every week I'll be dropping 3 free ones for you guys, or 3 matchups for free. And then if you want to hop onto the Patreon fully, you can get the rest of the card by going through there as well. And then lastly, shout out to the GodzillaWins folks, providing your boy a platform to drop written breakdowns to the public. Thursdays, we drop the main event breakdown. Fridays, we drop the 3 best Moneyline spots. If you guys want to check that out, GodzillaWins.com. Not only do they cover the UFC, but they cover all the other sports out there as well. So don't just rely on me on the UFC. You can go out there for the NBA, NHL. They're firmly in the finals right now, but we have a great team of writers and handicappers over there to take care of you and hopefully put some extra cash in your wallet. All right, that's a wrap on the intro here. We got 13 fights to break down for UFC Vegas 93. So let's kick it right off with the first fight of the night between Melquizael Costa coming in at -190, going up against Shailan Nuerdanbieke. We got minus 190 on Costa, plus 165 on Nuerdanbieke. Now Costa is trying to bounce back after a devastating knockout loss at the hands of Steve Garcia back in December. It started off pretty good for him as he was getting some good control up against the cage. He was unable to really complete any effective takedowns in that first round, but it was clear that he wanted to stay away from the big power of Steve Garcia so that he can get his jiu-jitsu advantage going. But Garcia showcased very good takedown defense, allowing him to be much more effective in the second round, where he was able to land a big shot on Costa and eventually follow up with even bigger elbows, leaving a murder scene behind as Costa started wrestling with the referee after the referee had stepped in to stop that fight. Costa took off more than enough time, 6 months away from the cage, to jump back into competition here and get back onto the winning track. Normally, he showcases a lot of lateral movement, long distance striking attacks, but also has a very solid jiu-jitsu game when he can mask his takedowns behind that. He was very desperate with the takedowns for Garcia, which is why I don't think it came as easily as we've seen him land takedowns in the past. And if he can go back to that, setting up his takedowns a little bit better, we should see him a little bit more successful in the cage compared to the last time we saw him. This weekend, he's going up against Shailan Nuerdanbieke, who also got put out by Steve Garcia in his last matchup, which took place over a year ago. And that was a matchup where we saw Shailan actually drop Steve Garcia with a big shot of his own and then grind out some solid control time to end off the round in the first round. But in the second round, it seemed like he was starting to slow down, and that's where Garcia started to put on the burners, and we saw him attack the body of Shailan, landing a beautiful leg kick and then a beautiful uppercut to followed up right away to just crumple Nuerdanbieke, and from there we saw Garcia end up getting his hand raised. Nuerdanbieke is a power puncher who largely likes to rely on dragging his opponents to the ground and grinding them out. He has knockout power early, but he does start to slow down, as we saw in the Steve Garcia fight, or during the 3-fight winning streak that he had before the Garcia fight. We saw him outlast most of his opponents and largely have control from that top position. If he's unable to secure it and is forced to fight off of his back foot, that's where you see him start to slow down, and that's where Costa could potentially have some success here. I think we'll see Nuerdanbieke look to land his big power and eventually get this to the ground, but I think Costa will showcase good enough defensive grappling with his jiu-jitsu off of his back, forcing Nuerdanbieke to work a lot, and then in the second or third round, I think we'll see Costa start start to run away with this fight with his long distance striking, attacking Shailan to the body, maybe even mixing in some takedowns of his own so that he can get his jiu-jitsu going. I just have slight hesitations in terms of the durability issue that we might see from Costa this time around, especially considering how badly he got put out last time. So at minus 190, this fight's a little bit of a pass for me. Costa by submission would be something I'd be interested in taking a shot on. Otherwise, I'm going to pass, but I do like Costa here as the minus 190 favorite. Next up, we got Josephine Knutsson coming in at minus 200, going up against UFC debutante Julia Polastri, who comes in at plus 170. Now, Knutsson actually got passed up on the Contender series initially, but was given a short notice spot to face Yasmin Lucindo back in September. Lucindo pulled out, in stepped Marnik Mann, and then we saw Knutsson just absolutely put a beating on Marnik Mann that night. Going into the fight, a lot of people expected Mann to have the grappling advantage in that matchup, but clearly the physicality of Knutsson caused Mann a lot of issues, and we actually saw Knutsson accrue over 10.5 minutes of control time over the 15 minutes that they were fighting. Knutsson normally showcases a very aggressive striking approach where she walks her opponents down and brutalizes them with elbows and knees and straight punches down the pipe. We have seen her get a little bit physical with the clinch and the takedowns, especially as we saw in the Marnik Mann fight, but it's really her strength and, like I said, her physicality that makes her so dominant against most of these opponents. We've seen a little bit of a flaw in her defensive grappling at times, but she is definitely improving and training over there at Team All-Star or the All-Star team, I believe it's called, over there in Sweden with, known for Alexander Gustafsson, Hamzat Chimaev and those guys. Obviously, she's not hand-in-hand training with those guys, but to get that level of coaching and experience, I think we'll see continuous improvements from her, especially with the base that she already has with her vicious kickboxing style. Her opponent this weekend, Julia Polastri, had a couple opportunities on the Contender series, and then she finally was able to get the win last time around against a opponent that was coming off of nearly 2 years away from the cage, and we saw Polastri go toe-to-toe with her in the first round. Two judges actually scored it in favor of her opponent in the first round, but it didn't matter, as in the second round we saw Polastri really start to take advantage of the ring rust of her opponent, because it seemed like her opponent really started to slow down. Polastri pushed her up against the cage, really warned her, and then eventually opened up a rear naked choke opportunity that she was able to get the tap in the last minute of the second round. Normally we see Polastri utilize her striking approach, throwing combinations, some good kicks. Defensive grappling has been a little bit of an issue for her in the past, as we saw with Jasmine Jasdovicius exposing that, but she has solid potential. She's still young enough, 26 years old, and she has a good base to this point. But in this matchup, I think the physicality and aggressiveness of Knutsson is going to cause a lot of issues for Polastri. Polastri might be able to land some good shots straight down the pipe as Knutsson remains aggressive and charges forward, but I think that we'll see Knutsson actually get to her clinch game, maybe even some takedowns, and really look to wear on Polastri on this spot. In women's MMA, a lot of the times, physicality is a big difference maker in fights. It's happened more often than not, and I feel like in this matchup, we'll see another example of that. So give me Knutsson here. I think she wins this fairly convincingly, and I think she does it by decision. Next up, we got Jekka Saragih coming in at minus 335. Who would have thunk it? A guy like Jekka Saragih being that heavy of a favorite, going up against Weston Wilson, who comes in at plus 275. And once you hear that second name, then you kind of understand why Saragih is such a big favorite in this spot. Now, Saragih was actually a part of the road to UFC the previous season, and he came up short in the finale as he lost to Anshul Jubli, who was able to take the fight to the ground, brutalize him from the top position, and eventually get that ground and pound finish in the second round. That is the big hole in Saragih's game, is if he's facing a talented grappler, he will end up coming up on the short end of the stick, because he just likes to throw leather. He likes to march forward. He likes to throw wide winging hooks and look to knock his opponents out. He's clearly trying to work on the defensive aspect of his game, or his grappling game, I should say. But I think at the UFC level, maybe against guys better than Weston Wilson, he will struggle to keep fights on the feet and try to keep himself in the fight, especially with the knockout power that he possesses. Last time around, we saw him actually pull off a big upset over Lucas Alexander, who was winning pretty much 90% of that fight with his distance striking. He was really touching up Saragih from distance, and you could see even one of the uppercuts that landed cleanly on Saragih seemed to rattle the brains of Saragih, but a wayward kick that was caught by Saragih eventually put Alexander off balance, and that allowed Saragih to launch a nuke at Alexander and put him out cold. That's the way that Saragih is going to win his fights. He's going to have to catch his opponent slipping so that he can take advantage and land that big shot to put these guys away. Otherwise, I just don't see how he remains competitive against most of the UFC roster. Luckily for him, the UFC is putting him up against probably the worst male fighter in the UFC in Weston Wilson, who got signed to the UFC at 35 years old, coming in on short notice to fight a guy like Joanderson Brito, got squashed within 2 minutes or so. Then he goes up against Gene Silva, squashed once again, getting knocked out 4 minutes into that matchup. Weston Wilson is a very poor man's version of Wonder Boy Thompson. He utilizes the same karate style. They train at the same gym, and he has a BJJ brown belt, which is where you see him get the most of his victories, especially on the recent run that he had. I believe he was on a 9-2 run before coming to the UFC, but all of his fights were being finished in the first round or him getting finished in the first round. His durability is a big question mark. He has a sneaky jiu-jitsu game, and that's kind of what gives me some pause here in terms of being completely confident on the Jekka Saragih side. Saragih should absolutely put his lights out. Weston Wilson, very questionable durability, but Wilson has the squirminess and the weirdness to potentially snatch up a neck of Saragih and take it on home with him, or jump on the back of Saragih and put him into a clinch position. I don't think Saragih has the physicality that Brito and Gene Silva did to keep him off of him. So there is a potential for Wilson to actually pull off the upset here. Now, I'm not going to go as far as predicting Wilson to win this fight. He's still probably the worst fighter on the roster, but you do have to put this fight into context. Saragih, power puncher, but how good is the rest of his game? We've seen Wilson snatch onto guillotines, even on his regional tape, from weird angles, and it might catch Saragih off of, just by surprise. So the under 1.5, pretty much the same line as Saragih money line. So maybe that might be the way to take it in case Wilson is able to snatch up some sort of submission, or even Wilson by submission at anything better than plus 600 to 700 might be worth a little bit of a sprinkle. But I do think at the end of the day, we see Saragih land that big shot, put Wilson out cold, but in no way, shape, or form should you be having, your entire bankroll on a guy like Jekka Saragih. He has so many holes in his game, especially in the grappling aspect, and it's something that Wilson could potentially take advantage of. But I'm not going to go as far as predicting Wilson here. I'm going to go Saragih by knockout, but just look at the props more than anything. All right, next up, we got Carly Judice coming in at plus 135, going up against Gabriela Fernandes, who comes in at minus 155. Now, Judice, even in defeat, ended up getting her name signed to the UFC after her Contender Series battle against Ernesta Kerescate. Together, they landed over 350 significant strikes over the course of 15 minutes, and it seemed like the short notice nature in which Judice accepted the fight came into play as she did start to slow down in the latter half of this matchup, but luckily was still throwing with enough resistance to keep her in this fight to see the final horn. It was a split decision loss for her, but she showed great things that night as she showcased her kickboxing background, which she's been training at Head Kicks in MMA, headed by former UFC fighter Aaron Phillips. And you can see when she does get comfortable, it's very hard to stop her with the flow that she gets into. She throws solid combinations, obviously very solid head kicks as well, and she's staying very active in the grappling realm so that she can try to improve the rest of her game to catch up with her striking. She recently actually introduced strength and conditioning into her game as well, or at least her training camp. So it'll be interesting to see how she really starts to tie everything together, especially with the physicality she could start bringing to the table. Will it make a difference right off the bat? I'm not 100% sure. She's 25. She's still very young in her MMA career, but that is definitely a good start for her to try to pack on a little bit of muscle and strength to deal with these, women that might be athletically much better than her or physically much stronger than her, because that will keep her away from being able to implement her game. Now, our opponent, Gabriela Fernandes, came into the UFC as the former LFA interim flyweight champion, but now she finds herself 0-2 in the promotion, getting outgrinded by both Jasmine Jasdovicius and then last time around against Teresa Bleda. That's clearly where the hole in Fernandez's game, and she's really needing to improve that defensive grappling if she hopes to hold on to a UFC roster spot. Normally, she comes from a boxing background where she showcases smooth, crisp combinations, and she also has some very nasty kicks when she's able to establish her range. She's very powerful, especially with how she throws and the viciousness in terms of throwing her kicks, and I think that could possibly cause Judice some issues in this spot. I expect this to be a back and forth striking battle. I'd be surprised if we see either woman actually engage in the grappling realm, although Judice could be the one that could maybe use her physicality to try to get this fight to the ground. But Fernandes is quite strong, and unless Judice has clean, crisp takedown technique, I think she might struggle to get Fernandes to the mat. From there, I think Fernandes could really get off on the better shots here. I think she'll be able to land the more damaging and more effective blows, at least in the eyes of the judges, that will cause a lot of reactions from Judice that could sway the judges in Fernandez' side if this fight were to hit the scorecards. Judice might be higher on the output. She might be able to land some big shots of her own, but unless she's able to drop Fernandes, I think there might be a clear indication that Fernandes is the one getting off on more significant strikes. Now we're seeing the line actually shift here as Fernandes opened around minus 230. She's down to minus 155 now, so there is some clear Judice love, but I think that's more of a line correction more than anything, as I do think that this will still be a close fight, and I do put Fernandes around that 60% range, so no real value on this line. I do think Fernandes wins this fight, but if we continue to see the swing in odds here and Fernandes gets closer to that minus 120 range, I might be forced to take a shot on her there, as once again, I think her striking will end up being the difference maker in this spot, specifically in terms of the damage that she's going to be able to land with here. So, yeah, unless Judice has this crazy wrestling background that I don't know about, I think Fernandes should be able to keep this fight upright and batter Judice en route to a decision victory. All right, next up, we got Josh Quinlan coming in at minus 125, going up against Adam Fugitt, who comes in at plus 105. Now, let's start off on the Quinlan side of things, who is 0-2 now over his last two fights, losing to Trey Waters by decision and then getting knocked out by Danny Barlow last time around. I believe that was back in... his UFC debut was August 2022, where he had a nasty knockout victory over Jason Witt, and then now he's been 0-2 recently, and he lost by third round stoppage in February to Danny Barlow. Quinlan, normally a power puncher, he likes to march forward, land his big shots on his opponents, and put them all away. I believe 5 of his 6 professional wins have come inside the distance. He's only won 1 fight on the scorecards. He is also a BJJ black belt, but often does not look to implement that style, as he just doesn't seem to have the wrestling game really down, at least at this level. We saw him shoot for 1 takedown against Danny Barlow and came nowhere near close to completing that takedown, and then he was stuck at range once again as Barlow was getting off on his speed, his damage, and then eventually getting that finish like he did in the third round. Quinlan, solid fighter, but I just don't know if he's UFC level at this point. He's going up against a guy in Adam Fugitt who's looking to bounce back from a second round submission loss at the hands of Mike Malott last time around, and Fugitt has really changed things up, and he's been away from the cage for a year, but it seems he's been trying to plant his roots over there in Arizona as he's teamed up with the Fight Ready guys to try to make the most of this stage of his career. He's 35 years old. If he hopes to even get into the rankings, he's really going to have to string some wins together here, and I couldn't think of a better team for him to go to try to get his skill set a little bit sharper so that he can go out there and try to get some wins. Leading up to this, he trained out of a gym in Oregon, not very well known, not many high-level fighters or notable fighters coming out of there, but now to go down to Fight Ready and, get the guidance of guys like Eddie Cha, Santino DeFranco, and training partners like Mahashate and Kelvin Gastelum, we could see some improvements in Fugitt's game. Coming into the UFC, he had a decent style. He had good output, all-around game. Last I saw, he was a BJJ brown belt from over 5 years ago. Maybe he's a black belt by this point in time. Good pace, nice high kick as we saw him knock out Solomon Renfro in the fight before coming to the UFC. It's just his striking defense at times need a little bit of work, but he showcases good movement from distance. It's just he has a lapse in judgment every now and then in the pocket that allows his opponent to land that big shot and put him away. I'm hoping the training and the guidance that he's getting over there at Fight Ready will allow him to be a little bit sharper in the striking realm, knowing when to let go, when to back out, when to pivot off, and that should allow him to maximize the volume and activity that he normally brings to the table. Quinlan, even if he looks to go to the grappling game here, I just don't think he'll be successful in terms of taking Fugitt down, and I think he's going to be rendered to just fighting with his power punching style once again, and I think that Fugitt will showcase superior movement and land some good counters to keep Quinlan kind of whiffing at air. And I think that Fugitt could grind this fight out just off of output and volume and movement alone. So close fight. I get why the odds are where they are, but I do lean ever so slightly to the Fugitt side. I think we'll see his improvements from the new training camp that he's had, some new tips and tricks that he's been adding to his arsenal, and it could pay off for him here to hand Josh Quinlan his 3rd straight loss. So give me Adam Fugitt and Fugitt by decision. Our next up, we got Jimmy Flick coming in at plus 375, going up against Nate Maness, who comes in at minus 500. Now, Jimmy Flick is looking to build upon a January victory that he had over Malcolm Gordon in a fight that started off kind of rough for him, as Gordon was coming out like a bat out of hell, doing big damage, landing some big ground and pound as well, but ultimately unable to put Flick away in that first round. That caused Gordon to slow down, and even though he started off hot in that second round, once he was able to get that barrage off, we saw Flick change levels, get the fight to the ground, and immediately get to an arm triangle position where he was able to force the tap from Gordon. Those are the types of opponents that Flick is going to be able to beat at this stage in his career. He returned from a 2-year layoff, I believe it was. 2-year retirement back in January of 2023, if I'm not mistaken, and he got battered by Charles Johnson. Then he'd follow that up with another loss to Alessandro Costa, who was able to finish him as well. And then he bounced back with that one in January over Malcolm Gordon. But his striking, there's so much there for him to improve on and for fighters to take advantage of. That's how we've seen most of his opponents beat him. Just tee off on him on the feet, stop the takedowns, stay at distance, measure your distance, land your strikes, and get out. Because if he is able to get takedowns, especially when he's in top position, he's one of the hardest guys to deal with, because he does not give his opponents an inch to squirm or try to pull off a reversal or try to pull off any submissions off of their back. He is one of the best guys in terms of maintaining top position and flowing with his opponents. He's obviously very good at sinking in submissions and submitting guys. But it's just the gap in terms of getting the striking to the point that he gets that top position. That's very hard for him to do so at this level in the UFC. His opponent, Nate Maness, is going to make it very hard for him to do so. We've seen Maness get out-grinded by guys like Umar Nurmagomedov and Taira Ulanbekov, but when you see him fight traditional wrestlers, he's able to go out there and stop the takedowns or immediately work back to his feet and get his striking going and potentially even knock them out like he did against Tony Gravely. Last time around against Matias Mendonça, he showcased superior takedown defense, and even when he was on the ground, we saw him showcase good submission defense, as a large amount of the attacks from Mendonça was heel hooks, but we saw Maness rolled through a couple of them, get into a position where he can start raining down big blows, and then eventually able to get that TKO victory over Mendonça and pick up a big win as a plus 220 underdog. Maness is a savage striker. The guy throws in combinations, has nasty power, and is able to put most of his opponents away if he's able to stay in the striking realm. It's his defensive grappling that he's been working on hellaciously to try to be successful in the UFC. This will now be his third fight down at 125 pounds, looking to break past that 500 mark, as he is currently 1-1. In this matchup against Jimmy Flick, I think his takedown defense will be good enough to keep this fight upright. From there, he needs to measure his pace as best as possible and range so that he can get off on his effective shots, maybe even catch some uppercuts as Jimmy Flick looks to change levels and try to get this fight to the ground. And then from there, just try to find that big finish. Minus 500 is just a little bit too wide for me, because when you have favorites this wide, you want to make sure that they have the advantage in pretty much every aspect of MMA. If this fight were to hit the ground, which I don't think it will, but if it were, Jimmy Flick probably ties Nate Maness up in a pretzel. Especially if Flick is able to get that top position. But I do think we'll see Maness gauge his distance well, showcase the solid takedown defense that we've seen from him in the past. But Flick is just too unorthodox and so dominant when he's able to get that top position that things could get sticky should this fight hit the mat. So I'm not going to, go all out on Nate Maness in this spot. Even as KO prop is at like minus 210, you never want to pay that much chalk on a specific prop, although it does look like the most likely outcome in this spot. Maybe a little bit of a sprinkle on Flick by submission, which is sitting around that plus 500 line. That's the best way for Flick to win this fight. But I do think that we've seen enough improvements from Maness that he should be able to keep this fight upright and then eventually land that knockout here against Flick. But again, minus 500, just a little bit too wide for my liking. All right, next up, I'm very excited for this flyweight matchup as we have Taira Ulanbekov coming in at minus 225, going up against Joshua Van, who comes in at plus 190. Now, it was interesting because this matchup and the main event actually did a little bit of a switcheroo, as we had originally Taira Ulanbekov against Alex Perez and Joshua Van against Tatsuro Taira. But the UFC decided to switch up the matchup here to put Taira in the main event slot, and ultimately Joshua Van now has to fight a much tougher wrestling threat in Taira Ulanbekov. Ulanbekov. Now, Ulanbekov, like I said, minus 225. Last time out, completely dominated Cody Durden en route to a second round submission victory. Ulanbekov still has a tremendous amount of potential to get in to the title contention and title race, especially with how relentless and how good he is with controlling his opponents, getting the back of his opponents, and eventually opening up that submission opportunity. We saw Tim Elliott provide a bit of a speed bump in Ulanbekov's ascent to the top, as the unorthodox nature and just high output and activity level of Tim Elliott caused Ulanbekov a lot of issues there. But I think Ulanbekov learned a lot from that matchup, and there aren't many fighters like Tim Elliott that are going to cause him that much issue, providing as much resistance as Elliott did in the grappling realm there. Normally, when Ulanbekov can get that dominant control or that dominant top time, it's hard for opponents to get off any sort of success or pull off any reversal or try to get back to their feet. His striking, not that bad. It's not his shining spot. It's obviously all to eventually set up the takedown, whether it's to push his opponents against the cage, use the body lock, get them to the ground, use sacrifice throws as we saw in his last matchup. He has plenty of ways to try to get fights to the ground. His opponent, Joshua Van, has been absolute fire since turning pro in October 2021. I believe he has a 10-1 record with 8 finishes. His only loss came in his third professional MMA fight, in a fight where he went up against a very strong wrestler who was able to shut him down and eventually pull off a second round submission victory. Van has worked on his defensive grappling a ton since that matchup, as he showcased great get-ups, good takedown defense, and then just going out there and sticking to his game plan, which is normally walking his opponents down, pressuring them, and mixing up the targets so well to the body specifically, and then opening up the shots to the head and breaking his opponents, just as he did against Felipe Bunez last time around. He is probably one of the brightest prospects that we have on the roster, and he's still only 22 years old. Is this too much for him at this point in time, though, going up against somebody as experienced and relentless as Tagir Ulanbekov? I think so. I'm a big Joshua fan, and I've going into researching this fight, I really thought I was going to be taking him as an underdog in this spot. But I feel like Ulanbekov's wrestling is the best wrestling that Joshua Van has gone up against since that fight that he lost. And if he's able to pull off the upset here by stuffing the takedowns, working back to his feet, and getting on the pressure with his striking, he will have completely sold me. But I think Ulanbekov can get enough dominant positions, maybe even get the back of Joshua Van, and I think he could potentially find a submission as well. I'm a little bit on the fence of even potentially pulling the trigger on the under 2.5 here at slight plus money. Ulanbekov could potentially get the submission. Joshua Van, if he's able to stuff the takedowns, walk Ulanbekov down, keep getting back to his feet if he does end up getting taken down, and sticking with the power strike, or not power striking, but just striking pressure that he normally brings to the table, he could potentially open up a finishing opportunity for himself too. But I do think Ulanbekov ends up getting to his grappling here. I think he ends up finding the submission as well. Minus 225, a little bit wide, especially considering the improvements that I've seen from Joshua Van in the past, but I just can't get over the fact that this is going to be the best wrestler that he has faced since his lone professional defeat. So I'm going to go Ulanbekov here, and Ulanbekov by sub, but I'm going to pass on this fight. Maybe violence under 2.5, but other than that, I'm just going to stay away from this matchup. All right. Next up, we got Brady Hiestand coming in at plus 155, going up against Garrett Armfield, who comes in at minus 180. Brady Hiestand is coming off of a matchup where he battled back from adversity against Dinab Batgaril, where he was able to, take a shit kicking through the first 2 rounds. There's no other way to put it. He got bloodied, he got battered, he was pretty much on the receiving end of a beatdown for about 10 minutes before he really put the pressure on Dinab Batgaril in the 3rd round, and eventually got a ground and pound finish with I think with less than a minute left in the entire fight. And all 3 judges had Batgaril up 2-0 going into that final round. So Hiestand definitely needed a finish if he wanted to get the victory that night. Hiestand is a guy that normally looks to go out there and take his opponents to the ground, grind them out, or even find submissions or ground and pound opportunities. He just hasn't been that active as of late, and that's a little bit of an issue, especially if he wants to try to gain experience and try to be effective at this stage of his career. He had to deal with staph. He had another injury as well, but he's looking to bounce back here keep the momentum going and get another dub this weekend. Originally training out of that sick jitsu camp. That's why you see Michael Chiesa in his corner often, grappling Grappling is the name of the game for Brady Hiestand, whose striking looks a little bit uncomfortable at times. Unless he is up against it like he was against Nuerdanbieke and kind of just throws all technique out the window and just tries to aggro his opponents, his striking, he just does not look all that comfortable. And that's why opponents have been able to tee off on him if he is unable to get takedowns. Now his opponent, Armfield, picked up his second straight victory last time around as he pulled off an upset against hometown kid Brad Katona last time around back in January at UFC 297. Now Armfield showcased solid striking that night as he continued to pressure Brad Katona and used his straight shots down the middle as well as some leg kicks to really get up on the output and activity over Katona through the first 2 rounds. And the third round is where we saw Katona have some success, but by then it was too little, too late. Armfield is a guy that comes from a wrestling background, but I think the best part of his game at this point in his career is the fact that he teamed up with Trey Ogden and Miles Johns over there at Marathon MMA, and they've done a great job in terms of establishing game plans and executing those game plans to their strengths so that they can go out there and get wins. His striking very much coming along as we saw him, outstrike Brad Katona last time around, even pull off a knockout victory against Toshiami Kazama, I believe the guy's name was 2 fights ago, but he has a ton of potential. His first loss in the UFC was his short notice debut against David Onama up a weight class, and we saw the size and the short notice aspect of that fight catch up to Armfield. But now settling in at 135 pounds and really just trying to stick to that game plan and just stick to his strengths, he's becoming a lot more successful, and I think he can be successful here against Hiestand. I think we'll see Armfield use his wrestling defensively here to keep this fight upright and utilize a solid striking approach to really touch up Hiestand on the feet. I think Hiestand will struggle with the straight punches down the pipe that Armfield presents, especially with the footwork, the pivoting off, and the angles that we usually see from Armfield with his striking approach, just as we saw with Brad Katona. As much of a fan as Hiestand as I am, I feel like this might be a step down in competition for Armfield to try to get his third straight victory, and I think he'll be successful in doing so. The third round might get a little bit iffy, but I do believe in Armfield's ability to stay out of too much danger, not get stuck in a bad spot like Nuerdanbieke did, and I think he should still be able to do enough to win the first 2 rounds here and grind this fight out, winning this fight on the scorecards over Hiestand by landing more damage over the course of the fight. All right, next up, we got Asu Almabaev coming in at -600, going up against Jose Johnson, who comes in at +425. Now, starting off on the Almabaev side, who pretty much walked through CJ Vergara last time around. I was kind of surprised that he was unable to finish him, though. He went 15 rounds. He went 15 minutes with him, landed his takedowns, but was unable to really pass the guard, but still landed good enough damage from that top position that Vergara was struggling to get off on any success of his own. Almabaev has decent enough striking that he can mask his takedowns very well behind his strikes so that he can get to where he is most comfortable, raining down shots from on top of his opponents. We saw how dangerous he could be against Ode Osborne in his UFC debut as he was able to get the second round finish there. And I think that this guy is a legitimate threat to be in title contention if he can continue stringing wins together at the rate that he currently is. I think he's one of the better fighters on the roster. He's on a crazy winning streak, and he is staying active enough that I think that we could see him in title contention probably by this time next year if he gets 2 or 3 more fights under his belt, especially if he's able to get the win this weekend. Now, his opponent, Jose Johnson, is looking to drop to 125 pounds for the first time at 6 foot with a pretty big reach, I believe. 6 foot, 6 foot height, 71-inch reach. He's going to look to bring that frame to the flyweight division and utilize his strength, which is usually his distance striking and his footwork. And I think that that's going to cause a lot of these flyweights some issues dealing with somebody that will always have a height and reach advantage and the kickboxing that he usually brings to the table. Not to mention, Johnson has been improving his takedown defense against a certain level of fighter, as we saw against Jack Cartwright on the Contender Series and even against Mo Miller on the regional scene. But it didn't work out too well for him against Damon Blackshear, who I believe Johnson took that fight on short notice. I could be wrong there, but I think Blackshear was just a much stronger grappler than other guys, and it found much better ways to get to the takedowns and then eventually pull off that twister the way that he did. Johnson last time around put on probably the best performance of his career as he pieced up Chad Anheliger over the course of 2.5 rounds and then eventually got that submission in the third. Now, I will say I thought Anheliger was changing the momentum in the third round, but Johnson did not give up on himself, eventually pulled off a reversal and then got that submission opportunity and not really cruise to a decision there, but rather get that submission victory. He is a long, lanky kickboxer who likes to utilize his movement and his range, but I think that's going to cause him some issues here against a guy like Almabaev, who does a great job in terms of crashing the pocket, staying busy there, staying in his opponent's face, and then pulling off the takedowns. I think the lankiness could provide some issues for Almabaev in terms of, the knees up the middle that Johnson could implement, or even the long limbs that could come into play off of Johnson's back. And if Almabaev is unable to pass the guard of Johnson, like he was unable to pass the guard of Vergara, things could get a little bit iffy for Almabaev from that top position, as Johnson will stay busy off of his back. He'll throw up elbows, he'll throw up submissions, he'll look for reversals, he'll look to buck Almabaev off of him. So it'll be very important for Almabaev to at least pass the half guard or side control, where he should be able to control Johnson a lot better and not worry too much about what's coming back from the Johnson side of things there. Minus 600. A little bit wide for my liking, especially with how high I am on Almabaev. I still think that Johnson provides enough issues in terms of his length, striking advantage, especially if he's able to stop the takedowns here. Things could get iffy for Almabaev real quick, but I do think Almabaev has a good enough grappling edge here to pull this one off. I'd look more so to, I want to say by decision, but I'm probably going to pass on this fight altogether. All right, next up, we got Douglas Silva D'Andrade coming in at plus 105, going up against Miles Johns, who comes in at minus 125. Now, D'Andrade will be a week short of his 39th birthday, which is usually not a good sign for anybody fighting below 155 pounds or even 170 pounds. But he is coming off of a victory over Cody Stamann last year, where he showcased a little bit more output and damage to the first 2 rounds, even though Cody Stamann was close to finishing the fight in the third round. I thought Stamann made a huge mistake following D'Andrade to the ground and letting D'Andrade kind of just tie him up and get his wits back about him, because then we saw the fight go to the scorecards, and then from there, Stamann did not do enough to warrant a 10-8, and then ultimately lost with the first 2 judges, or at least the first 2 rounds being scored in D'Andrade's favor. D'Andrade is a guy that normally relies on his big power punching style and dangerous threat of even that front choke to try to get his opponents out of there. Otherwise, he normally slows down and ends up losing decisions or ends up getting finished late. But there have been guys that are just a little bit too gun-shy, as we saw with Cody Stamann, that allowed D'Andrade to get ahead on the scorecards, or even Renan Barão from years ago when D'Andrade faced him. But I think we are going to start to see that slowdown of D'Andrade. We do see him slow down in fights, but I just mean in terms of his career. 39 years old, cutting the amount of weight that this guy does. He's chiseled out of marble pretty much with how we usually see him weighing in, having negative percentage body fat, it seems. But he's dangerous, power striking, has some good work from on top when he's able to get takedowns, but usually likes to just stick with the striking so he doesn't expend too much energy. If guys are able to put high paces on him, he normally starts to slow down, just as we saw Stamann start to take over late in that matchup. That's where he struggles. His opponent this weekend, Miles Johns, is a guy who's pretty much turned into a much better fighter since aligning himself with the Marathon MMA guys. He was for a long time training out of Fortis MMA. It seemed like he was a good fighter, but really couldn't break through to the next level, which ended up causing those speed bumps in his career. But he is a guy that, big power puncher as well, has some good wrestling chops as well, where he's been able to stifle opponents up against the cage or drag them to the ground and grind them out from that position as well. But he is a guy who has slowed down in the past, late in fights, and allowed opponents to kind of pull away or at least get into compromising positions, which would make it very rough for him to try to still get his hand raised. But since joining up with the Marathon MMA guys, it seems like they've done a great job in terms of instilling activity late in fights. So even though his body language does not look that great, he's still staying active enough, whether it's, getting the cage clinch going to slow down the fight so he can catch his breath a little bit more, going for a takedown, or even when he's skirting backwards, he's crashing the pocket enough with big power punches that it still causes opponents to be very wary of trying to let go and trying to take advantage of the fact that it looks like he's slowing down. The Cody Gibson fight was a perfect example of that, where Cody knew he was down 2 rounds going into that final round and tried really putting it on Johns, but Johns was crashing the pocket enough and hurting Gibson a couple times, landing a couple takedowns of his own, and really keeping Gibson second second guessing the offense that he was throwing in return. So I think building that confidence in Johns and seeing it come to fruition will only make him a more dangerous fighter. Is that going to make him somebody that gets deep into the rankings and potentially get a title shot? Probably not. But there's going to be a certain level of fighter that I think he can come up good against, especially with executing game plans as effectively as he has been in recent fights. And I feel like in this matchup, although the odds are close, I feel like Johns has a solid advantage here over Andrade. Obviously, Andrade could make things tricky early if he's able to land a big shot or even finish Johns early, but that's almost in any fight. But I think Johns has the ability to put together a game plan and execute it well enough to cause Andrade a lot of issues. That's going to be a lot of movement, causing Andrade to throw at air, slow him down a little bit more, using high activity with that movement, throwing punches in return, wearing on him up against the cage, not going for desperation takedowns, but trying to sneak in takedowns and level changes to keep Andrade thinking and overwhelming him, his nervous system, and even deep in this fight. Andrade will slow down just as Johns might slow down, but I think Johns will showcase a good enough game plan and activity and volume to keep Andrade on the defensive for the majority of this fight, allowing Johns to grind this out and showcase, what he's been showing over the last couple of fights. The Dan Argueta fight was another big one, even though it got changed to a no contest. Seeing that fight, seeing the activity level that Argueta was trying to put on him, and seeing how he defended, got off on his own offense, landed some big shots, hurt him a couple times. Even the Cody Gibson fight, Miles Johns is a much better fighter than he was when he fought John Castaneda. And I think the reason that this line is as close as it is because of Andrade's performance against Cody Stamann. That was because Stamann allowed him to get ahead on the strike count there. I don't think Johns will allow him to do that. He'll keep him on the defensive up against the cage with takedowns or even landing offense of his own, and then eventually start running away with this fight as Andrade's threat level starts to drop later on in this matchup. So give me Johns by decision, and I think minus 125 is a pretty damn good line to take advantage of. All right, next up, we got Timmy Cuamba coming in at minus 205, going up against Lucas Almeida coming in at plus 175. Now, Cuamba made his short notice UFC debut up a weight class last time around against Balaji Oki, and that was a matchup that I believe went to a split decision, but I do think that Oki deserved that fight no matter what. That night, we saw Cuamba deal with the power punching style of Oki. Cuamba had a little bit of wrestling success in the second round there, but I thought Oki did enough in the first and third rounds, landing big shots to hurt Cuamba. Didn't really get close to getting him out of there, but hurt him enough and landed enough damage throughout that matchup to still get his hand raised. Cuamba originally comes from a wrestling background, but you see him implementing the wrestling game, the striking game a little bit more. In his last couple of fights, he utilizes a lot of lateral movement, a lot of backwards movement, but does enough in terms of throwing back so that it kind of cancels out the backward movement that he's doing. Throwing in good combinations, some good high kicks as you saw him land that knockout victory that led him to the short notice UFC fight. He was one of the few guys that actually did not get signed off the Contender Series last season because of how I think Dana even thought his opponent won that fight, if I'm not mistaken, but it wasn't the best performance. Regardless, he goes back to the regional scene, gets a head kick knockout, and gets the short notice call-up, and ends up in the UFC anyway. He's still young, 24, 25 years old, if I'm not mistaken. Striking, slowly getting better, but it's really his wrestling. If he can rely on that, that will allow him to get wins at this stage of his career. His opponent, Lucas Almeida, is staring down the barrel of a pink slip if he's unable to get his hand raised here and avoid a 3-fight losing streak. Last time around, we saw him get knocked out by Andre Fili, who the unorthodox nature and movement that Fili brought to the table really caused a lot of issues for Almeida. And then when Fili crashed the pocket the way that he did, Almeida was not expecting it, and that caused him to, get dropped and eventually grounded and pounded there. Almeida is normally a guy that likes to utilize his Muay Thai striking style, throws in combinations, nasty kicks, usually thrives in the pocket, but if opponents are not willing to trade with him in the pocket, then he kind of starts whiffing at air and allows his opponents to start getting ahead of him. The Mike Trizano fight was a great fight for him because Trizano was having his own success as well. I believe he dropped Almeida a few times there too. They were going back and forth, but at the end of the fight, closer to the third round, we saw them have to exchange in the pocket a little bit more, and that's where Almeida was eventually able to get that knockout victory. Almeida, solid fighter, but it's just his durability that's a little bit of an issue, but also his defensive defensive grappling, which is what fighters have used in the past to try to take advantage of him. They keep him away from the striking advantage that he might have in some matchups and keep him defensive on his back, as he doesn't really have the best process in terms of working back to his feet. And I think that's what's going to cause him some issues here with Cuamba, as Cuamba uses a lot of lateral movement. He'll be able to touch up Almeida a bit. Hopefully he's able to stay out of the pocket too long, or long enough that he won't get caught by any sort of counter from Almeida. But I do think it's going to be the takedowns from Cuamba which eventually get him that top position and an ability to grind out and wear on Almeida. I don't think Cuamba will get the finish. I think we'll see him put together a good enough body of work to get his hand raised on the scorecards. But this youngster taking on a bit of a veteran in Almeida, who's had a handful of UFC fights under his belt at this point, just not trustworthy at this point, especially at minus 205. That's a little bit too much chalk to be taking on a fighter who I don't think has the best resume against experienced enough opponents. I think the best fighter that he's beaten is Matteo Vogel, and that was a very close fight. Almeida will definitely provide some resistance here and may end up being a good underdog, but I do think Cuamba has a good enough toolkit here to go out there and grind out a decision victory. But I'm staying off of this fight all in all. This line is just a little bit too wide for my liking. All right, co-main event time. We got Ikram Aliskerov coming in at minus 1,400, taking on Antonio Trocoli, who comes in at plus 800. Now, Aliskerov is coming off a nasty knockout victory over Warlley Alves last time around, and that was on the back end of a Phil Hawes knockout victory that he earned before that. Aliskerov normally relies on his wrestling as you would expect him to, but his striking is very much coming along, which is how he's been able to get his victories most recently. Now, with more confidence, throwing 1-2s down the pipe, showcasing good footwork, that will allow him to earn the respect of his opponents in the striking realm so that he can mix in the takedowns behind that and get to his grinding grappling game as we've seen in the past. A lot of people have some high hopes on him, as I believe the only loss on his record is at the hands of Khamzat Chimaev, and that's what he was originally known for. But considering the run that he's on, especially with finishing his opponents as of late, he's getting a lot more respect now. And, the UFC was originally propping him up to fight Paulo Costa back in October. Costa had to pull out, and we saw Aliskerov have to take on Warlley Alves. But the UFC thinks very highly of him, especially by putting him in the co-main event slot against a short notice newcomer here. So, solid skill set all around. I don't want to get too far ahead of him in minus 1,400, just way too much for him. But he should win this fight against Antonio Trocoli, who is going to be fighting for the first time since late 2021, where he defeated a guy who was 7-1, which looks good, but the guy was a complete schmuck in terms of dealing with a guy the size of Trocoli. Now, Trocoli started off his career, I believe, in the welterweight division. He actually has regional losses to guys like Jacob Volkman and Diego Lima. Then he followed that up with another loss up a weight class at 185 pounds. Then he got onto the Contender Series where he fought Kenneth Berg at 205, submitted him in the first round, but then popped for steroids. And even though he was given a contract that night, he ended up getting cut, went to the regional scene, had that one fight against a squash match, and then eventually gets called back to the UFC late in 2022 to come in on short notice, I believe, to fight Khalil Roundtree. That fight does not end up coming to fruition. They try to match him up against Umar Sy earlier this year. That doesn't come to fruition. Now he's hoping to make his debut this weekend against Aliskerov. His striking looks kind of mediocre. His wrestling offensively not that bad. Defensively kind of bad. That's where guys in the past have been able to beat him, is by taking him to the ground and forcing him to fight off of his back. Now, he was a guy that used to be a welterweight, and he was quite skinny at that time. Now he's really put on the weight. He's coming back to 185 pounds for this matchup, so it'll be interesting to see what kind of frame and shape he comes in, especially considering that this will be a little bit of a short notice matchup for him. But I think he's just a little bit outmatched in the spot. Again, minus 1,400, there's never a reason to put that into a parlay, considering how much of an advantage or how much benefit it does to a parlay, very minimum. But I do think Aliskerov wins this fight. The over 1.5 kind of seems interesting to me at plus 150. If he can't put Trocoli away early, he probably ends up grinding this fight out and cashes that over 1.5. I do think that Aliskerov wins inside the distance. Close fight. But yeah, I'm gonna pass. Over 1.5 is kind of calling my name, but I'm just not fully on board yet. But I do think Aliskerov wins inside the distance without too much issue here. All right, main event time. This is a big-time fight here in the flyweight division, as we have Alex Perez coming in at plus 160, going up against Tatsuro Taira coming in at minus 185. Now, Perez if you were to say last year that in 2024, within the first 6 months of the UFC calendar, we would have two fight night main events featuring Alex Perez, a lot of people would probably call you a liar. But here we are. He had a very competitive fight with Mohamed Mokaev back in March. I believe it was March. Ended up losing that on the scorecards, but showcased a much better form than many people were expecting of him. Then he comes back, or right after that, he accepted a short notice match, or not a short notice, or at least a fight right away with Taira Ulanbekov, I believe, for the card this weekend. But then he got a short notice opportunity against Matthias Nicolau at the end of April, took that opportunity, came in as an underdog, knocked out Matthias Nicolau, getting his hand raised there. I believe it was a second round knockout, showcasing that he is fully invested and back in the game now. A lot of people ragging on him over the last couple of years due to a myriad of issues, not to mention the numerous fight cancellations and pullouts that he had, the weight issue that he had, but now he looks fully immersed, fully back, and looking like the guy that was chalk pretty much in all of his fights leading up to his title shot in 2020. So he gets that victory over Matthias Nicolau in April, and then accepts Taira Ulanbekov for this card. The UFC pulls a switch rule a couple of weeks later, gives him the main event slot against Tatsuro Taira, hoping to get a winning streak going this weekend. Now, Perez, normally a solid wrestler. That's what he showcased during his come up in the UFC. Very strong from that top position, smashing opponents from the top, getting submissions as well. Very solid fighter, but his striking has very much improved. We saw him defeat Jussier Formiga, a high-level flyweight from back in the day, with just leg kicks alone, battering the calf of him. Now he's improved his striking as well with his hands, as we saw in the Matthias Nicolau fight, setting up traps, letting them go, and knocking these guys out cold. The confidence is at an all-time high, and we know his wrestling is always in his back pocket if he needs it. Now, his opponent this weekend, Tatsuro Taira, BJJ Wizard. Absolutely crazy what this kid has been able to achieve at 24 years old. 15-0. I believe 5-0 in the UFC, or 4-0 in the UFC right now, finishing his last opponent as viciously as he did in Carlos Fernandes. That shit was insane, the way he was able to drop him and then get that ground and pound off. Even what he was able to do in the first round with those big shots. On the ground, wizard. Striking, still trying to improve, because we've seen him get touched up on the feet by other opponents. Edgar Chairez was touching him up in rounds 1 and 2, but for some reason, rather than looking to utilize his takedown defense, he was clamping onto guillotines, jumping guillotines, hoping to get Tatsuro Taira out of there, and that allowed Taira to grind out the rest of those rounds with top position, sway the judges back in his favor, and end up putting that fight on the scorecards. So his wrestling, traditionally speaking, I'm not super impressed with. He's just always finding weird ways to get guys to engage with him on the ground. Even Carlos Fernandes was looking for takedowns, looking to engage in the clinch with him, which made no sense to me. Even after dropping Taira, or at least getting Taira off balance, he followed him to the ground, allowing Taira to eventually pull off a reversal and get on top of him. Not a good look. I'm sure Taira will get some confidence from finishing Carlos Fernandes last time around the way that he did with this straight right down the pipe, but that's going to get harder and harder to achieve against higher levels of competition. Is this too early for him to get a jump up in competition against a former title challenger? Maybe. I think Perez is really in his bag right now. I think Perez is a guy that if, as long as Taira doesn't have this godlike power in his hands that he's found all of a sudden, I think Perez could absolutely touch him up on the feet. We know his defensive wrestling and submission wrestling is good enough to stay out of any major trouble. Taira might be able to get some, back control time, maybe eat some minutes off the clock just off of controlling him if he's able to just, catch Perez off balance or jump on his back or, pull off a weird takedown that Perez isn't really seeing coming. But if Perez can actively keep this fight upright, he should have the striking advantage here. I wouldn't even be surprised if we saw him go back to the leg kicking game, just as he did against Formiga. If you remember, Formiga, high-level BJJ black belt as well, and Perez just decided to chop off his leg and then eventually finish him that way. Maybe he looks to do the same thing here against Taira, who's going to be looking to take this fight to the ground, so he might be a little bit heavy on that lead foot. So at plus 160, with all the experience, with all the talent, with the defensive grappling, and potentially the striking advantage here, I think Perez could absolutely give Tatsuro Taira the first loss of his career. And last thing, the Mokaev fight. There are small mistakes Perez made in that fight that he could have potentially pulled away with and actually won that fight. And I think he'll make up for those mistakes in this matchup against Taira and come through as a plus 160 underdog. So, fun fight. Taira, absolute beast of a prospect, but this might be the loss that he needs to eventually take his game to the next level. And he's still early enough in his career that he can bounce back from something like this. But I think Perez, this is kind of karma for him in a sense, right? He's going through all those bad times. Now the good karma is coming back his way. And this might be one of those spots where he's able to, again, stop the takedowns, get that calf kicking game going. That might be very helpful, or even just let the hands go, stay away from that maybe newfound confidence that Taira has in his hands, and really just make it a rough night for the Japanese fighter here. So vet lesson incoming, in my opinion, Alex Perez. And I'm leaning inside the distance. I for some reason, I just foresee that calf kicking approach being very effective for him here, and that either leads to a TKO on the feet, or eventually just leg kicking Taira's leg off and getting the win that way. But I do like Perez here. Plus 160 straight up on the money line is a good enough spot for me as well. There you guys go. 13 fights broken down for UFC Vegas 93. Reminder, Wednesday evening, I'll have my top 3 lock of the night candidates, top 3 dog of the night candidate videos drop for you guys, as well as PFL breakdowns as it goes down on Thursday. So stay tuned for that. Appreciate all the love and support. Drop a comment below, shit talking, say nice things, whatever it is. Whatever you guys say, I will always be back here on a weekly basis, breaking these fights down for you guys, whether you like it or not. So say what you want. It's not going to detract your boy. Good luck on all your action this week, folks, and I'll see you guys again tomorrow. Peace.